What if I told you that the princesses you grew up watching were never actually Disney's creations at all? That behind every ball gown, every magic spell, and every happily ever after lies a story that is centuries older, far darker, and far more human than the animated versions we know? Snow White didn't start in 1937 with Walt Disney. Her story was first written down in 1812 by the brothers Grimm, but even they borrowed it from a 1634 Italian tale called La Schiavatella by Giambattista Basile. And if you dig even deeper, historians believe Snow White was inspired by a real 16th century German countess named Margaretha von Waldeck. She was known for her skin white as snow. She was sent away from court due to political conflicts, and her stepmother was rumored to use mercury-based cosmetics that literally poisoned her. The seven dwarves weren't just cute side characters. They represented the miners of the Harz Mountains where Margaretha lived. And the poisoned apple wasn't random either. In medieval Europe, apples were commonly used to mask the taste of poison. So what Disney turned into a children's fairy tale was actually a warning about jealousy, political power, and the dangerous beauty standards of royal courts. Cinderella feels just as timeless, but her story is even older. Disney's 1950 film came from Charles Perrault's 1697 French version, yet the oldest known version is called Yixin, recorded in China around 860 AD during the Tang dynasty. In that version, there was no fairy godmother. There was a magical fish, a golden slipper, and a stepmother who was even more brutal. The famous glass slipper is actually a translation mistake. The French word was pantoufle de verre, meaning fur slipper, but it was misread as verre, meaning glass. Once that mistake entered the story, it stuck forever. What makes Cinderella fascinating is that over 700 versions of her story exist across different cultures, from Egypt to Vietnam to Ireland. The reason is simple but harsh. In most pre-modern societies, marriage was not about romance. It was about survival. For women with no inheritance, no rights, and no protection, marrying into a higher class was often the only way to escape poverty and abuse. So the prince in Cinderella wasn't a dream lover. He was economic security. That's the real history hiding behind the sparkle. Then comes Aurora, the sleeping beauty of Disney's 1959 film. Disney got her from Perrault in 1697, but Perrault himself took her from a 1634 story called Sun, Moon, and Talia. And this version is deeply disturbing by today's standards. In the original, the prince doesn't kiss her awake out of love. He finds her sleeping, and things happen that she never consents to. Consent wasn't even a concept in 17th century storytelling. The 100-year sleep itself reflects real medieval fears. Europe lived through repeated plagues, famines, and what people called sleeping sickness. Entire kingdoms would go dormant, economically and socially, for decades. The thorns that grew around the castle were how people described the isolation of fortresses during long wars. So again, this wasn't just a bedtime story. It was a metaphor for collapse, waiting, and rebirth. Ariel, the Little Mermaid, is Disney's most famous example of a story that was completely rewritten for film. Hans Christian Andersen published his version in 1837, but mermaid mythology is over 5,000 years old. Cultures from Syria to Greece to West Africa all had stories of half-human, half-sea creatures. Andersen didn't write his tale for children. He wrote it after falling in love with a man who didn't love him back, and he used the story as an allegory for his own struggles with identity and acceptance in 19th century Denmark. When Ariel loses her voice, that's Andersen talking about giving up his own writing style to fit society's expectations. And the ocean in 1837 wasn't a magical place. It was death. Sailors had a 40% chance of never returning. So Ariel's choice between her family and the prince wasn't about romance. It was about risking everything for a world she barely understood. Disney gave us a happy ending, but Andersen's original ended in tragedy because that was the reality of his time. Belle from Beauty and the Beast carries a different kind of historical weight. Disney's 1991 film used Jean-Marie Leprince de Beaumont's 1756 version. But the first version was written in 1740 by Gabriel Suzanne Barbat de Villeneuve, and it was over 300 pages long. In 18th century France, arranged marriages between young girls and much older, often cruel noblemen were normal. These men were the real beasts. Belle's decision to see beyond physical appearance was radical for her time. The castle in the story was inspired by the real Château de Chambord, and the enchanted rose was a symbol of time running out in political marriages. Every second counted, and one wrong choice could ruin a woman's life. So Belle's story is about agency, intelligence, and refusing to be defined by fear. Mulan is unique because she's one of the few Disney princesses rooted in what might be real history. Disney's 1998 film is based on the Ballad of Mulan, a Chinese poem written between 400 and 500 AD during the Northern Wei dynasty. Historians still debate whether Mulan existed, but we know women did disguise themselves as men to join the army during periods of constant war. The highest virtue in Confucian society was filial piety, and Mulan's choice to take her father's place was considered the ultimate act of loyalty. Unlike Disney, the original ballad has no romance, no songs, and no mushu. After serving 12 years in the army, Mulan returns home. The emperor offers her a high government position, and she refuses. She just wants to go back to her village. Disney added the identity crisis and love story to make it modern, but the real Mulan was about duty, sacrifice, and the cost of war on families. Tiana from The Princess and the Frog represents a completely different historical origin. She's not based on an ancient fairy tale. She's based on American history. Disney's 2009 film draws from E.D. Baker's 2002 novel The Frog Princess, which retells the Brothers Grimm Frog Prince, but Tiana's world is set in 1920s New Orleans during the Jazz Age and Jim Crow laws. She's Disney's first black princess, and her central conflict isn't about finding a prince. It's about entrepreneurship, racism, and building a future in a system designed to stop her. In 1920s Louisiana, black women owned less than 0.5% of all businesses. Tiana working 2 jobs while chasing her dream of opening a restaurant was not fiction. That was daily reality for thousands of black women. The frog curse comes from Grimm, but Tiana's determination, her work ethic, and her vision come straight from the spirit of the Harlem Renaissance and Black American resilience. And finally, Moana. She breaks the pattern completely because she isn't based on a European fairy tale at all. She's based on real history. Disney's 2016 film is inspired by Polynesian navigation and mythology. The Polynesian people colonized the entire Pacific Ocean starting over 3,000 years ago, and they did it without compasses, without written maps, and without modern technology. They read the stars, the ocean swells, and the flight patterns of birds. Moana's ancestors were real explorers, real voyagers, and real heroes. Maui, the demigod, is based on figures from Maori and broader Polynesian mythology. The heart of Te Fiti represents the balance between land and destruction, Te Fiti being growth and Te Ka being volcanic fire. This reflects how Polynesian cultures have protected their environment for centuries. So while most Disney princesses were softened versions of dark European tales, Moana is one of the few whose roots are in real courage, real exploration, and real cultural pride. So when you watch these films again, remember this. Disney didn't invent princesses. They borrowed them, they softened them, they added music and color. But the original stories are about power, about survival, about war, about women navigating systems that tried to control them. Snow White warned about politics and poison. Cinderella taught escape from poverty. Sleeping Beauty reflected collapse and rebirth. The Little Mermaid was about identity and sacrifice. Beauty and the Beast challenged arranged marriage. Mulan showed duty over desire. Tiana proved that the American dream was hard-earned. And Moana reminded the world that women were explorers long before they were damsels. Every once upon a time is hiding a once upon a real time. And maybe that's why these stories still matter. Because they're not just fairy tales. They're history.